Och, the wind in the clear days dawn blaast de kluts heel sterk uit die oude bay. But there's meer naar a rochwind blowing through the great glen of the world today.
Now imagine Christmas if all you had was Mark and John's Gospels. No shepherds, no wise men, no manger, no Herod, and therefore no massacre of the children. You wouldn't be challenged by the Holy Family as refugees, and your community would not be built up quite so much in their devotion and their joy at the season. I doubt that we in particular, for whom fasting, except if we're trying to lose weight, is as meaningful as it's still in other cultures, that we have Luke's need to build up Jesus's credentials as someone who ate nothing, though nobody can claim he drank nothing, who ate nothing during a period of biblical shorthand for long enough for change, like the rain for the flood, the years in the desert, and so on. And yet we can grasp sufficiently the point of uphill conditions and what it's like to be under pressure, be it even the quandary of a local church whose gas boiler has died in wintertime, being alarmed by the upfront cost of a sustainable option, rather than that tempting like-for-like replacement with its steeply rising costs ahead. But as I was saying, if you want a meaningful launch to the season of Lent from Luke alone, like Christmas without the star and the manger, you're lacking key points of the character of wilderness. Although Luke does enrich the Lent experience with the concentration on the priorities that drive human impact on the planet. The glory, or otherwise, of our aspirations to rule and possess. What does it mean to possess an inheritance? Certainly something rather different from just owning property, especially the property of land, the earth, the planet. Is this our planet? What do you think? Inheritance is not an object to be bought and sold with no strings attached. Indeed, the obligations, both to previous and future generations which are implied in inheritance, are alien to capitalist buying and selling. Because inheritance brings responsibility for justice in every transaction, for the results of our giving and our receiving, the results of our exclusion and welcome, whether we're remembered or not, that we are dust, and to dust we do return. Biblical jubilee, when everything is reset, is not about holding power forever. For Luke in particular, Satan's junk mail offer is not the earth, which remains God's own, but the human regimes and their aspiration to possess. And our familiarity with fraudulent trading helps us recognize Satan's offer as abusively belittling of what it concerns. Satan claims to have been given the glory of the human regimes of the world, though evades appreciation of the richness of what it means to possess inheritance. Satan says,
"It's been given over to me and I give it to anyone I please."
That's a sad echo of attitudes to fellow creatures which were previously encouraged by Christianity, but which, with the lead given by Pope Francis and many others, we have had the courage to leave behind. And the indigenous witness is that our fellow creatures, even those to which we relate as predators, are ours as our family is ours, and not simply that we may destroy them at our pleasure for our own ends, our own benefit or satisfaction. So much for Luke, but in a few short words, Mark frees us to value and not to waste our wilderness. Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days being tested by Satan. He was with the wildlife and angels attended him. The value of wilderness clarifies for us in step with the impact of environmental crises. Biodiversity, carbon capture, the management of waters and more, those are the glory of the nations now. Those are the green feathers in their cap. And whatever seemed merely beautiful and therefore expendable now turns out to be indispensable to the life we share, and therefore any inheritance we may aspire to possess. Possess? Possess. It's an old English legal principle that possession is 9 points of the law. We're beginning the season of Lent with readings that reflect how possession and property and inheritance determine our actions and our behaviour towards our fellow stakeholders in God's rainbow covenant, our care for the earth. The earth who, both in the Exodus and in our day of crisis, who expresses in signs and wonder and terrifying power the will of God for justice, the anger of God at oppression, the anger of God at the belittling and othering of life. But our possessions do impact on our identity. Am I a man of property? But so does the inheritance that God so subversively offers inclusively, irrespective of power, privilege or property. Out in the wilderness, we meet John the Baptist. Do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham, or even out of these slowly rewilding spoil heaps. Lent insists on the rights and authority and contribution of wilderness, and how we relate to that impacts on how we rise to the challenges of our day and age and living planet. The relationships with those entities of which we say they are mine also vary greatly. Marriage vows allow that we have and hold a partner, though we've also, and very happily, moved on from ideas that the partner thereby sacrifices all personal freedom and self-determination. Partners in marriage belong to each other, but to see a partner as private property would be to cross the line to abuse, and the same may be true of the land we call our home. Now, as I was reporting on some of the presentations in the COP campus, our friend Reverend Rory MacLeod of Skye provided this insight from Highland culture, which says much about a human relationship with a homeland.
In former days, when a chief was inaugurated, the ceremony included the marriage of the chief to the land in the expectation that it would be fruitful under good leadership, yet bad leadership would have the opposite effect.
Now in Scotland, where most land, like where I'm standing, is considered private property, it's nonetheless accessible, subject to the three principles of the right to roam: respect for the interests of other people, care for the environment, and responsibility for your own actions. These are principles, one could say, which would have got Jesus through the testing that Satan had lined up for him, even in a land laid waste like this. For Luke, apart from Luke's acknowledgement that wilderness is a frequent and intentional place of prayer for Jesus, it looks as if the prime significance of wilderness was emptiness of people. For us, the rainforests, the richest and most abundant biodiverse habitats, tick the wilderness box, but I wonder how Luke would have appreciated that. Or indeed the idea that when God gives a home to God's creatures, that does not imply the expulsion of others. Possession does not imply dispossession. How would Luke grasp the place of the small and ecologically significant populations of indigenous people in whose care, if not in whose legally certified possession, is 80% of the world's biodiversity, often within what we might call wilderness? Mark, by contrast with Luke, makes it clear that, as will be familiar to anyone who's immersed themselves into a wilderness, Jesus lived alongside the wildlife and that angels took care of him. Fasting or not, Jesus found hospitality in wilderness. Because wilderness, even if it's abandoned by people, is the inheritance possessed by that wildlife. And angels are agents of and dwellers in creation. They are servants of God, who is the sustainer of heaven, the sky, and earth both, who gives possession and who stands with the dispossessed. Angels in the wilderness are perhaps, if I can say this without romanticisation, like the human participants in so many wilderness landscapes. That made me think too of the ravens who fed Elijah, and the repeated futile attempts of theologians to identify those ravens instead as people. Now, if they were, then human hospitality sustains and embodies the will of God. There's nothing wrong with that. But if they were not, as most scholars agree, we see the hospitality of creation, hospitality being the oldest and most fundamental of all sacred and ecological duties of faithful people, and indeed of humanity as a whole. Wilderness then is the place given by God as a habitat and inheritance to the wildlife. To those whom an Inuit woman at COP described without artifice as
our animal relatives. And I say that because I think that that's who I'm most concerned about, who is impacted.
Even if land is given by God to us, it is not ungiven by God to them. So although Luke presents a landscape void of human domination, I'd like to suggest that the idea of a wasted land is foreign to most Bible writers, and that it must be also rejected by us, even as we embrace our horror at colonial history, where Europeans landed with guns on the shores of an ancient homeland and declared that habitat terra nullius, a void and vacant property ripe for exploitative possession. Perhaps God alone can create a wilderness, but wasteland, well, that's human prerogative, though, as I'm noticing on these 5 heaps of industrial waste, it may not be a permanent one. A dry wilderness into which come streams of living water, as might be the case with infrequent rainfall, rapidly becomes a blossoming wilderness. It ceases to be parched but does not cease to be a wilderness, even as life bursts forth in green and active fruitfulness. A species given a habitat as their inheritance may add to its richness, but does harm if they merely dominate. Monoculture, where even the diversity of the hedgerows is banished, that is the true desert. The fitness of our survival happens through negotiation. An ecosystem is a sensitive web of interdependence, and the result of that, again an indigenous view consonant with the Bible, is wealth. Our territories are not given other than to be conserved, said a leader from the Amazon, not as an economic commodity, but, listen carefully, as a source of wealth. They even went so far and felt so unthreatened in doing so as to invite observers like me to see the Amazon as my wealth, also my inheritance, for which, therefore, I have responsibility. I hope we are humbled by that sort of invitation. In Deuteronomy, it's taken for granted that there will be foreigners and those in need, and that possession of the land implies taking care of their needs too. Not in any concessionary fashion, but so that they may eat and be satisfied. The result of just and careful living in the promised homeland is therefore not exclusion, but generous hospitality. And that way, and no other, lies wealth that is worth celebrating.